Hi, welcome to the DRH show where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a trauma recovery coach, Ronia Fraser. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Dennis. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, Ronia. So, share to us your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
So I'm an award-winning trauma recovery coach and a clinical hypnotherapist. I'm also one of the leading experts in the field of narcissistic abuse recovery. And that's a topic I'm personally very passionate about because, as you can imagine, you don't start working in that kind of field unless it has happened to you. So I'm a narcissistic abuse survivor myself. And I went on my own journey with my own frustrations. And I was really determined to find something that would actually work and reverse the damage as effectively as it was caused. And that's how I do what I do today. So since 2017, I've been working with abuse survivors from all over the world to help them get back on their feet and regain their mental health and recover who they were always meant to be.
Now, thank you for sharing to us your backstory, Ronya. Now, let's dig deeper into what kind of abuse you're actually helping people to
Yeah.
recover from. So, what exactly is narcissistic abuse?
Well, narcissistic abuse, it's become a bit of a social media buzzword over the last couple of years or so, which is a good thing because it raises the awareness. However, it still remains one of the most common but least acknowledged and least understood forms of abuse. And what we are talking about is emotional and psychological abuse on the most sophisticated level. So we're talking about calculated brainwash. We are talking about the tactical erosion of identities. We are talking about emotional blackmail. And the challenge, of course, is that it is invisible. So oftentimes, what still happens is that narcissistic abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, is still seen as kind of like secondary as compared to other forms of abuse, which are more acknowledged, if you will. But oftentimes, they also go hand in hand.
And I know it seems quite straightforward for you, but for the benefit of the audience or someone who's trying to find out if they're actually falling into being a victim of narcissistic abuse, what makes it so dangerous? And if you just could give us like a brief outline of what are the mental health implications of this type of abuse.
Yeah, sure. What makes it so dangerous is that it literally creeps in with a smiling face, but then very quickly, it's not actually like it's not unlike the drain unblocker you pour into your sink, and then within seconds you have corrosion, within minutes you have erosion of the underlying block, and that's exactly what happens with narcissistic abuse as well. But obviously, if we apply that to ourselves, what we are talking about is the erosion, corrosion of our reality. And because it creeps in with this smiling face and under the pretense of really true love and an immense trust, that can happen very, very quickly. And it's literally like somebody is wearing a mask and takes the mask off, but at that stage, you've fallen in love with your soulmate because it's like they pretend to be this most amazing person you've ever met, and then they take that away from you. So when you are in that situation, it's very likely that you don't even realize that you are, especially in the beginning, because it's just so subtle, a bit like the frog in the boiling water, right? That the heat is being turned up so gradually that you actually don't realize that you are in danger until it's too late. And at the same time, it also doesn't make any sense because as a healthy person, you would never ever do something like that to another person. So even in the beginning, when you start picking up on things, you're very likely to just brush it off because it doesn't make any sense. And an analogy that I've come up with to explain it, because it's such a weird thing to get your head around what's actually happening there, is the game Jenga. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the game Jenga. It's like the children's game with that
No.
tower, and you pull out one building block after the other, and then it starts. Well, you lose when the tower collapses, right? And that's exactly how narcissistic abuse actually works, because we all have those building blocks that make up who we are, right? So personal, professional, financial, aspirational, whatever you mean it, whatever it means to you, right? We all have those building blocks. And then what happens is that a narcissist comes in and pulls out one building block after the other until literally our life comes crashing down. So they're playing reality Jenga with our life. And some of them are so sophisticated at what they do, they will actually pull out that most fundamental building block straight away. So when we talk about narcissistic abuse, time literally isn't of the essence. It can be a very short-lived relationship and nevertheless cause really significant damage. And following on to your next question, it has, without fail, really detrimental impact on the mental health of the survivor. What all abuse survivors experience will be symptoms like severe anxiety, depression, difficult to control emotions. There is like this really, really intense sense of emptiness, of sadness, which they have never experienced before. And actually, it is so intense because what happens, and I already mentioned it just briefly, is this tactical erosion of someone's identity. So everything you thought you were, everything you thought the world worked, it doesn't apply anymore. So this intense sadness that abuse survivors experience, it's actually they're grieving themselves because they lost who they are. There is erratic behavior is very typical, self-destructive behaviors as well, which can literally be anything, right? I mean, when we think about self-destructive behaviors, we may be thinking about alcohol or drugs, but it can be literally anything. It can be casual, unprotected sex. It can be food. Very often, food is used to, for emotional purposes. And it can even lead to suicidal ideations. So the list of mental health challenges that come from narcissistic abuse as a consequence is rather vast. And so oftentimes the abusers, not the abusers, the survivors will be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or complex post-traumatic stress, depending on who they talk to, what their attitude is to mental health, what their qualifications are, and their knowledge around the topic of narcissistic abuse in particular, which is a challenge because even though it's a buzzword, it's still not understood really well.
Just to follow up on that, Ronia, because you properly shared to us the metaphor of a frog on a boiling water, and just like you've said, it's very subtle. So from your own experience and from your own expertise, so what kind of like telltale signs that will really make you, like I'm really suffering from a narcissistic abuse? There are also buzzwords that goes with it, like gaslighting and stonewalling. Is that part of narcissistic abuse, or is it? Do you have to, be wary when someone is like checking your phones or looking after your whereabouts, that kind of thing? Is that part of narcissistic abuse?
It is. I mean, it's so vast. We're talking about coercive control. We are talking about manipulation, and there are so many different forms of narcissism and narcissistic abuse. So that list literally goes on and on and on. And as you said, there are certain technical terms that we now associate with narcissistic abuse that have become very common, also quite overused at times, which is the danger, right? When we're talking about social media buzzwords. But the tell signs, because oftentimes we focus on what the abuser does, right? What I like to talk about is actually what is going on for you in that situation, because that's the actual telltale sign if something is actually really wrong. So if you have a partner who constantly runs hot and cold and you never actually know who you're dealing with, and that in turn makes you walk on eggshells all the time because you're so afraid of saying something wrong, doing something wrong, and unleash this monster that is in there somewhere when the mask comes off, that definitely is a sign that it is a toxic, abusive relationship. What else? If you look in the mirror and you don't recognize that person looking back at you anymore, that's also a sign that something is happening, because, as I said, a big part of narcissistic abuse is that tactical erosion of someone's identity. Everything that you thought you were, everything that you held dear, everything that you valued, all of a sudden that becomes less and less and less. And then you will all of a sudden find yourself looking in the mirror and not recognizing that person looking back at you, maybe not seeing anything at all, because you literally disappear. So that's something that is a sign that there may be something going on, or not maybe, is going on in the background that you may not be consciously aware of at the time. If you talk to people and you try to make yourself understood, but everybody just looks at you really blankly because they just don't get the horrors that you're experiencing, whether that's family or friends, maybe even the therapist, that's also something, because narcissistic abuse, narcissistic relationships are nothing like normal relationships, and neither is the breakup. So then when you get all this well-meant advice, like snap out of it, get over it, time will heal all wounds, and it just simply doesn't apply. So if you find yourself in a situation where you keep talking about it, but no one gets it, and you are literally dying on the inside, that's a very high indication that you have a toxic relationship. So what else? There are quite a few things. So also what happens a lot, especially in the early stages, because we said we don't really recognize that what's being done to us is abuse, because oftentimes it's all we actually know. What also happens in the beginning, we know nothing about narcissists. We don't even know that they exist, which also means we don't have the language to explain what's actually going on. So one thing that every single narcissistic abuse survivor has said in one way or another is something along the lines of, I feel like an addict, or they are my heroin, or they are my drug. And it actually doesn't only feel that way, it is an addiction that we are talking about. And what makes it so complex is that it's an addiction to the highest high there is, because it's an addiction to love. And love is the most basic human desire that we all have. So if you've heard yourself say something along those lines, like, I feel like an addict, then that's an indication that there is a narcissistic relationship going on, because what happens is that they get you hooked on the love, and that's what you want to have back every time the mask comes off, because they have shown you how it can be. Unfortunately, that was never real. And then the abuser turns into the drug and the drug dealer at the same time, giving them complete control over how you're allowed to feel. What else? Oh yeah, actually, very important one when we talk about narcissistic abuse is, if you've ever said something along the lines of, I think I'm losing my mind, I think I'm going crazy, then that's an indication that there is a narcissist at play. Maybe they have even started calling you crazy, and that's where the gaslighting comes in, Dennis, that you have mentioned before. Because what they do is they just twist the reality to such an extent that it causes so much confusion in the victim that they don't seem to be able to remember anything. Everything they do remember doesn't seem to be true. And it's really, really twisted. And in turn, they will start questioning their reality, their sanity. And what also oftentimes happens is that there are mind-altering substances involved. Maybe you drink more than you would normally drink with that partner. Maybe you start doing drugs. And of course, if we already have mind-altering substances in us that alter our mind, it makes it much easier for the narcissist to actually do their work, because the manipulation is much easier if you don't remember anything anyway. So that's really something to look out for. If you are questioning your sanity, if you say something along the lines of, I'm losing my mind, I'm going crazy, and then they jump onto that narrative just to make sure that you do know that you are crazy, and everybody around you start thinking that you're crazy, you start behaving crazy, even though it's completely out of character. That is a big, big, big red flag and indication that there is a narcissist at play.
Absolutely. And another thing that I want to learn from you, Ronia, is what kind of people are likely to fall victim to narcissistic abuse. Well, there were a couple of sources that said that those who were brought up by narcissistic abusive parents, they likely to go on to form relationships with narcissistic people, and they sort of believe that this is the kind of normal relationship.
Yeah.
As an expert, would you agree that this is a trend, or this is like, a cycle?
Yes, I would agree with that. But again, it's so multi-layered. There can be so many different causes. So you don't have to have a narcissistic parent to fall into this pattern. Of course, it all comes down to our programming, our conditioning, how we grew up, how we see life, how we see relationships. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a really abusive childhood. And some people do have obviously really big trauma in their childhoods. It doesn't have to be that way. It can simply be a parent who was absent. Maybe they had to travel for work a lot, right? So there isn't always like this really bad intention behind it, and then we get this full deprogramming on the way. Very often, more often than not, it's very unintentional. And when we are children, we just don't have the emotional resources to deal with certain situations. So maybe we had a parent who was quite strict. Maybe we had a parent who, as I said, maybe traveled for work a lot. And as a child, we don't know if they ever come back, right? Maybe we had a parent who had their own things going on and couldn't give us the attention, the affection, the love that we needed as children. But it doesn't always have to be really big trauma. It can be really subtle things. It can be something that one person said, and for some reason it got stuck. And what I've actually noticed, because the idea of an abuse survivor is like this, let's talk about women, right? Like this weak woman who would just, can't stand up for herself, and that's why that partner gets away with that behavior, and maybe not very well educated and all that kind of stuff. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because most abuse survivors, most abuse victims actually are really highly functioning women, smart women, independent women. Applies to men as well, by the way. And they actually have like all their life together. They might have this really amazing career. They might even be standing in a boardroom and run the show with like all those male executives around them. But then all of a sudden they go home and it's a whole different story. So I think that's something that's really important to understand, that oftentimes abuse survivors don't actually fit that picture, that general picture that we have of abuse survivors, which also makes it, or abuse victims, let me say the victims, because we're talking about the people it can happen to. And that also makes the recovery much more challenging, because I remember when I was going through it and I really needed help, because I was at the end of my road. And I had this really successful career and I was highly functioning, and all of a sudden I found myself not functioning at all. So then when I was looking for help, people would just go like, oh, it's Ronnie, she's going to figure it out. They didn't realize how, some still don't actually, how severe it actually was, because they would never expect somebody like me to find myself in a situation like that. And that happens very, very often. And that's also another thing why narcissistic abuse is so dangerous, because it all happens behind closed doors. And on the outside, nobody will actually ever have an idea that something might be wrong.
And based from your experience, Ronia, are there any gender differences or cultural impacts? I mean, my question comes from a place of ignorance. This is relatively new to me. So, because I have this stereotypical notion that someone who would be experiencing narcissistic abuse are predominantly women, or is that just a stereotype? And also, like, when people kind of live in a patriarchal society, they're more likely to experience narcissistic abuse. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there are some stereotypes that do apply. Narcissistic abuse at the same time is something that literally doesn't discriminate against anyone. It doesn't discriminate against age. It doesn't discriminate against gender. It doesn't discriminate against nationality. It can literally happen to anybody. And what we often talk about is, oh yeah, it's men abusing women. But more often than not, actually it happens the other way around as well, which comes with its own challenges, because obviously as a man being abused, actually getting to the point to acknowledging and admitting that this is happening, that's a whole different thing than for a woman, because as a woman, it seems easier to speak up, even though you're dealing with the same problem. The problem is always not being believed, and people just not taking it seriously. And there is also always a lot of shame, a lot of guilt that comes with it. And that applies for both men and women. It doesn't matter if it's a same-sex relationship, it can be a gay relationship. It doesn't matter if it's a man, if it's a woman. It's not exclusively to romantic relationships either. It can be a work relationship. It can be your boss. It can be a parent. It can be a sibling. It can be a friend. And that's what makes narcissistic abuse so complex and so wide reaching, because yes, there are certain stereotypes. However, it literally applies to anyone in any kind of situation.
I'd like to go back to that metaphor of the frog that you alluded to earlier, because people who haven't experienced narcissistic abuse would say that, so why don't the frog just jump out of the water? So basically, why do survivors get stuck? Like when you begin to realize there's something wrong with this kind of relationship, so why don't they just walk out away from it? What makes it too difficult for them?
Well, there are various different things that are at play here. First of all, it just doesn't make any sense. So what you want is you want that really amazing, loving, caring, supporting person back that they pretended to be. And if we have certain unhealthy conditioning, unhealthy programming, oftentimes maybe sacrificing ourselves just for the sake of being loved, when we've experienced that love always is conditional, then we put up with those sorts of behavior anyway, because it is what we know. So that's one thing. And that's also one of the reasons why it may take quite some time to even realize that something isn't right. Having said that, every single abuse survivor can feel it in their gut. When you talk to them, every single person who comes to me tells me, I knew right from the start that something was wrong. But because you can't put your finger on it, because you're experiencing something you didn't even know existed, we tend to then override our intuition for the sake of being loved, if that makes sense. Then as the relationship progresses, what often also happens is that there are threats involved, and it's really important not to underestimate the power of that brainwash that's happening there. Because if you constantly get told that you are unworthy, that you won't be anything without them, all those kind of that starts very subtly. But as your identity erodes more and more and more, and you start believing this more and more and more, then you start losing your mind, then they play into that. So it's so multi-layered. It's actually really difficult to even get to grips what's happening here, and then even more difficult to get out, because as I said, what we're dealing with is an addiction, right? It literally requires to cut off your supply and go cold turkey. And that's why a lot of abuse survivors, what happens is when they come out of the relationship, it actually feels worse than being in it, because they've left their comfort zone, but their comfort zone actually was a horrible place to be to start with. However, they would get their supply every now and then. And that's why that relapse happens very often. It's very, very multi-layered. And then again, depending on the kind of abuser you're dealing with, if there is physical abuse involved as well, stalking, all those kind of things, it's really a life and death situation that abuse survivors find themselves in. So there are many different reasons why they wouldn't recognize it, why they wouldn't walk away, and then sometimes when they do, it ends in disaster.
And of course you help a range of people who are experiencing this kind of abuse. So as someone who's an expert when it comes to recovering from this kind of trauma, what would you say are the keys to recovery?
Well, the keys to recovery are, first of all, and that's rule number one, and every person that's come out of a narcissistic relationship and started learning about it and probably can write a PhD on the topic, everybody knows that. Rule number one is no contact with the abuser. And that's also one of the most difficult steps to take because, as I said, what you're doing is you're cutting off your supply. However, it is really vital for the recovery because as long as you stay connected with the abuser, you won't heal. It's impossible. Like you can literally do the best therapy in the world. It's not going to work as long as the abuser can still interfere. And of course, there are situations where you have to be in contact with your abuser because maybe you're sharing children, maybe you have legal proceedings going on, maybe you're running a business together. But in those cases, the contact needs to be really highly modified with no personal touch whatsoever. There are certain apps that you can use which also document everything that's being said, and it can't be edited, which then will come in handy if there are legal proceedings. And it really needs to be no personal contact whatsoever, no chit chat, no how was your weekend, how's the weather, and getting drawn back in because that very easily happens. And it has to be really, really neutral. So no contact is a non-negotiable, actually. No ifs, no buts, because what you need to do is create a safe space that allows you to do what you need to do for your healing, and that needs to be trigger free. And when you come out of a narcissistic relationship, your mental health is not very good. So that's why it's so important to create a safe space. Then another key to healing really is taking responsibility for yourself and for your healing. And we all have this romantic notion of the knight in shining armor that will come and save us and take all this pain away. Now, in reality, and you already know that, it will never happen. The only person that can fix that is yourself. And that's why taking responsibility for your healing, for your well-being is a key to recovery. If you don't do that, you won't heal. Another key to the recovery is shifting the focus. So Dennis, you probably are not aware of this because it's a new topic for you, but what happens for every abuse survivor, once they realize what's actually going on, they become really obsessive about the topic. And they learn everything about the narcissist, about narcissistic abuse, trying to figure them out, catch them out, maybe beat them at their own game. And literally every person I meet, they could write a PhD on the topic. So there's a lot of technical knowledge there. However, there is no healing happening in that part of the process. It's a very important process because knowledge is power, right? But as we already said, the damage is much deeper than that and has to be addressed on a much deeper level as well. However, as long as you keep your focus onto the narcissist, on what's happened, if you keep telling your war story over and over again, which happens a lot in all those support groups, forums that are out there, which are actually very detrimental to the healing as well, because they are just not coming from the right place. There's a lot of anger there, a lot of resentment, a lot of bitterness. The language is very bad. But as long as you engage in that side of the equation, you won't heal. So the key is really shifting the focus onto yourself, onto your healing, your well-being outside of the story. And don't get me wrong, of course, everybody has the right to tell their story, but it's very important how we tell that story and what that place is that we come from, because it's very important to understand that the brain actually can't distinguish whether we are talking, whether we're imagining something or whether something's happening for real. So if you actually keep telling your story over and over and over again, for your mind and your body, it's like it's happening over and over again. So very, very important key, changing the focus, stepping out of the story. And then, of course, you have to put the work in. And what I see a lot is that people just look for this shortcut or like a magic pill that make all of this go away. But what we are talking about is complex trauma. And it doesn't only have to do with what's happening right now, because as we already said, there is still developmental trauma is the underlying cause to start with. So this is really a very personal transformational project and a fantastic opportunity actually for just weeding out your garden. But you have to put in. Now, the good news is that that's actually possible. And the common narrative is, oh, you can't do anything about it. But of course, you can do something about it. And with the right tools and the right support, it's actually much easier than you think. So the recovery doesn't have to be this long and really painful road. There are much more gentle ways to actually approach that. And what a lot of survivors really struggle with is, okay, so how do I actually shift the focus? Because all I can think about is them. All I can think about is what happened. And the key to that, and that's probably after no contact, the second biggest rule really is self-care. Self-care, self-care, self-care. And it sounds a bit like a no-brainer. However, a lot of abuse survivors, when they find themselves in that situations, one of the reasons is because they've never ever put themselves first. They've always sacrificed their own well-being for others' well-being. So this is really a big, big learning that abuse survivors have to go through, that they deserve to be treated well, including and most importantly by themselves. And once we actually start engaging in self-care, the impact is pretty much instant. Same with no contact. No contact actually is the biggest self-care decision you can make for yourself. And the impact is actually very instant and makes such a huge difference, but it's really like pushing through that because it most likely is the very first time in their lives that they actually do something for themselves.
Well, Ronia, thank you for highlighting to us the importance of self-care and self-compassion. That's really important, whether you're suffering from narcissistic abuse or any other mental health issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but my question to you is that when it comes to mental health, we've already made significant progress. You know, like just a quick Google search, you'll find a range of toolkits and psychological support. They're very accessible compared to the previous decades. But why is it that traditional therapy seems not to be suitable when it comes to narcissistic abuse? Why do they need to, you know, seek the support of a trauma recovery coach such as yourself?
Well, I think first of all, textbook just doesn't apply to narcissistic abuse. That's one thing. And as I mentioned before, there is just a huge lack of understanding of the whole concept of narcissistic abuse and then the consequences and what to do about that, which oftentimes causes this disconnect because obviously somebody is suffering with their mental health. They may not have even put it in connection with an abusive relationship. They go somewhere, they look for help, but then therapists, coaches, medical professionals might not even pick up on the signs that are really present that would indicate the abuse. So that's one thing, the lack of understanding. And then also, as I already mentioned, right, the brain cannot distinguish whether something's happening for real or whether you're imagining it. So if you go to talk therapy and you talk about it week after week after week, then all you really do is re-traumatize yourself, because for your mind and your body, it's as if it's happening again and again and again. And don't get me wrong, there is a place and a time for talk therapy, but this is not it, because no healing will ever happen in the story. Also, when we talk about, let's say, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in that case, you may get to the point where you realize, oh, this is actually what got me into trouble, right? Which goes back to the programming. And then you realize that, you accept that, and then you cognitively change your behavior. Now, the challenge with that is that we are all emotional beings, and we are talking about really deep, complex trauma. And before we do anything, we feel something. So the healing, the really profound healing from narcissistic abuse needs to happen on an emotional level. The healing won't happen here. And a lot of survivors, they actually get to that point because they literally know everything there is to know, but for some reason they're just not getting better. And that's because the healing needs to go a level deeper to actually heal from the inside out rather than the cognitive function.
Mhm. Now, Ronia, I suppose we also need to look at the other side of the equation, because it's not just the survivor, but also the abuser. So can you provide a sort of a theory? Why do we have people who become narcissistic abuser? Is it just down to parenting, or is it a traumatic childhood experience? What's your experience on that?
Well, it can be anything, really. And what's really obvious for a lot of narcissists is that they do have a sob story, right? There will always be a difficult upbringing, a lot of trauma happening, and that's exactly where the catch is as well. Because if you attract a narcissist, it's very likely that you actually want to save other people. You're a bit of a rescuer, you have all this love to give, they give you the sob story they have, and that's pushing your buttons where you go like, oh, I'm going to save you with all this love I have to give. Now, those stories most likely are true. However, the difference is a narcissist uses it to lure their victim in. However, they will never actually do something about it. And at the end of the day, it's really like two sides of the same coin, right? Because when we are children, we need to find a strategy to survive. And if there are traumatic events, if there is emotional neglect, if there are challenging situations, we choose a strategy, and that may go either way, right? So you may choose a strategy, again, as a child, you do the best you can with what you have. You may choose the strategy to sacrifice yourself for the sake of love, because love was always conditional. And then you get this programming on your way. You may also choose to a different strategy where you just cut out any kind of emotion and empathy to protect yourself, right? At the end of the day, none of us wants to get hurt. However, even though all the abusers, they have their own trauma, and yes, something has happened, and yes, it comes from somewhere. As I said, the difference is they use it for their purpose. However, they don't have the self-awareness to actually do something about it. I hope that made sense.
Yes. And Ronia, earlier you kind of addressed some misconceptions about narcissistic abuse when it comes to gender and nationality and culture. But because you already have quite some experience when it comes to dealing with people who are survivors of narcissistic abuse. But can you tell us more about misconceptions that you've come across and sort of address those misconceptions?
When we talk about the abuser, also very often they're very charming, successful people, very powerful people oftentimes. So again, it goes a bit in the same lines as the image we have of an abusive husband, the image we have of an abused wife, right? And oftentimes that's not what reality actually is like. And I think the biggest challenge with narcissistic abuse is, as I said earlier, because on the outside, nobody would ever know, which is also part of the whole setup, right? Because once you, as the victim, start speaking out, everybody is just not going to believe you, because that person is just such an incredible, kind and caring person. They are oftentimes involved in, charities and really building up their amazing image, which makes it very difficult for the victim to then actually be taken seriously and be believed.
Now, do you have any quick tips on how we can promote harmonious relationship? Because this all just boils down to, you know, promoting harmonious relationship. Any tips from you?
Well, my biggest tip is really weed out your garden. And as I said, with the right tools, the right support, this is really possible. And actually, it becomes really fun once you realize how much power you actually hold. And when we change our inside, our outside changes, right? Which means once you start doing the work on yourself, it will disrupt the dynamic between you and the narcissist, very simply because they have nothing to offer you anymore, because you've done your healing, right, from the inside out. That hook they had before, it's not going to work anymore. At the same time, you have nothing to offer them because you won't be responding to their games. And that's why it's important to really take responsibility for your healing and put the work in, because that's how you can ensure that it won't happen again in the future. And very naturally, when we change our inside, the outside changes. The people that come into our lives are much higher quality people. And that's how you then get into more harmonious, more healthy relationships with healthy people. But it all starts with you.
Okay, absolutely. And Ronia, we already learned about, and thank you for sharing to us your wisdom about narcissistic abuse and how we can promote harmonious relationship. I've got a few more questions, but this time let's shift our attention to learn more about the human side of Ronia. So this is more, you know, the personal side of Ronia. So my first question to you is that particular individual who has the greatest influence on your work?
Good question. I think Bessel van der Kolk, the book The Body Keeps the Score, that was a complete game changer for me. Just the way I looked at trauma, the way I looked at what was going on for me, and also shifting the focus away then from the narcissist and onto my own healing. And who else? It's a very difficult question because it's been a very, very lonely journey, and you just go out and you put the puzzle pieces together. From a modality point of view, I can say that NLP completely changed my life. So I guess I have to credit Richard Bandler for that. But again, I use different tools and made them work for me, right? And when we talk about NLP, the reason why it is so powerful in the healing of the damage from narcissistic abuse is because it's neuro-linguistic programming, right? It addresses the neurological damage, it addresses the linguistic damage, and it's what helps you reprogram those outdated and faulty programs. So that has been a complete game changer for me.
Absolutely. And as like what you've said earlier, of course, this is really a multi-layered aspect of relationships. So you really kind of like have an eclectic approach. So you pick up bits and pieces from all sorts of sources and inspirations. So Ronia, what's the most important thing you want the public to know about your work? What's the big message from Ronia Fraser?
The big message is that there is something you can actually do about it. No matter what anybody else says, this is actually solvable. And I also want you to know that you are not alone, even if it may feel that way right now. And yeah, keep going. And as I said, take the responsibility for yourself and put the work in. And it's so going to be worth it coming out the other side of this.
Okay. And Ronia, for those of people who are watching this, who wants to follow your footsteps, who've been inspired by your journey, what's your advice?
Again, my advice is put the work in and go out and explore what works for you. as I said, there are tools that are very useful for the particular purpose of narcissistic abuse. And I mean, I've developed this program for that exact purpose, my program. But I really would like to encourage everyone to go out there and explore different things. I mean, there's breath work, there is EMDR, there is yoga, there is shamanic healing, there is NLP, there is hypnosis. And it won't be like one thing that actually is going to solve all of this. Again, you have to put the work in, and it requires 100% commitment. You will find that it's a combination of various different things that work for you. Trauma release exercise. There are so many different options that you can use, and I really would like to encourage everyone to go out there and explore and make it work for them. And again, with the right tools, the right support, this is actually a very, very doable mission that you're on to come out the other side of this.
Mm-hmm. And Ronia, do you have a professional dream?
Do I have a professional dream?
Mm-hmm.
I would like to change the way we look at and treat mental health from a professional point of view.
Okay. And what do you think you would be doing if you didn't work as a trauma recovery coach?
Oh, I'd be an accountant. I was an accountant before. I was head of finance for a big international business, and I would just be doing that, crunching numbers, being unaware of me, who I actually am, as opposed to who I thought I was. And I would just be leading that kind of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 live.
And finally, Ronia, the floor is all yours. So tell us what else is in the pipeline. If people wanted to reach out to you, what platforms can they get in touch with you at? And remind us again of your platform.
If you want to reach out, my website is roniafraser.com. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook, Rock and Roll Coach Ronnie. And what do I have in the pipeline? I always have lots of stuff in the pipeline. It's best to just come in and check out my website to see what's actually happening right now, depending on when you watch this interview, of course.
Rock and roll coach. Did you used to be a musician before?
No, I used to be an accountant in the music industry.
Accountant in music.
I just look like a musician, but actually I'm not.
Okay. Ronia Fraser, it's a pleasure having you here on the DRH show. Again, thanks for sharing your insights and your wisdom, but unfortunately, time is against us. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you so much for having me, Dennis.